Just a little heads up in case you somehow didn't see the thumbnail. This video is going to have quite a bit of math in it. Even worse, the math in this video probably won't be perfect or anything. I'm just a high schooler after all. If you asked anyone who's been in their fair share of Celestial fights what they thought the worst attacks in the fight were, chances are one of the attacks I'd mention would be server cutters or global cutters. And oh boy, that attack got a ton of complaints. I mean, it only took me like 5 minutes just to find these screenshots. I'm sure I could find more if I took a bit more time, but you get what I mean. The main issue is that it feels so random, whether or not the cutter decides it wants to stop right on top of you and kill your shield. What if I told you it wasn't random at all? Before I describe exactly how to predict every cutter, let me guide you through my journey of actually developing the strategy. I was looking back at some of my Celestial footage, and I thought to myself, is there some kind of pattern to where a cutter will land? To satisfy my curiosity just a bit, I decided to analyze a few cutters frame by frame. The only clips I had on hand were of client cutters rather than server cutters, but don't worry, I verified that all information in this video apply to both client and server cutters. After doing my analysis, I found something quite interesting. Cutters seem to land on practically the exact same spot that they spawned on. Here, let me show you a few examples of what I mean.
That's a void.
This is the very first frame where the cutter is actively visible on the screen. Pay attention to its position relative to the C mine. This is the final frame right before the cutter actually fires. Notice how it is right on top of the same C mine I mentioned. On the first frame, the cutter appears slightly counterclockwise of the C mine, mainly because it starts moving too fast for a 60 FPS recording to see it on the exact instant it spawns. If that's not enough, here's another example. Once again, the first frame of the cutter. Pay attention to the trip mine here.
Bro, this person is making me not.
And the final frame of the cutter is right here. The cutter now overlaps the same trip mine, very close to where we saw the cutter spawn initially. This all but proves my previous statement that cutters will end in the same position they spawned in. When I discovered this, I figured that I could just stay away from where the cutter initially spawned at, and as a result, I'd be away from where it'll end up landing. Seems pretty simple, right? Not quite. I mean, look how small the cutter is when it spawns, and look how fast it moves right as it spawns. Obviously, if I'm inspecting a video frame by frame, I can see exactly when and where the cutter starts, but in the middle of the fight, I wouldn't realistically be able to pinpoint the exact location the cutter spawns at, and I doubt anyone watching right now will be able to either. Don't worry though, this is still an important discovery. I've already found that there's at least some kind of predictability to a cutter. Right now, the issue is that it spins too fast to reliably see where it spawns. So, I'll just reverse engineer its speed. I'm going to place an imaginary point right where the cutter spawns. Then, note the amount of frames between each time a ray of the cutter touches this point. For simplicity's sake, let's ignore the 3000 and say we began at frame 137. After it starts spinning, the first time the cutter touches the point is at frame 145, or 8 frames after our starting point. The second time it touches is 16 frames after the start. The third time, 27 frames. The fourth time, 47 frames. The fifth time is a whole 99 frames after our start, and is when the cutter actually fires. I then proceeded to do the same process with a few more cutters, just to verify that my data could generalize to all cutters. Once I was done, I put all of my data into a few tables. For some clarification, T represents the time in frames since the cutter's spawn. C is an arbitrary measure that represents how many times the cutter has touched the point, starting at 50 on spawn, decreasing by 10 at each touch, and firing at 0. Though this isn't shown in the tables, values like 45, 35, etc. would mean that the cutter is right in the middle of a cycle, and you can fill in the rest. I graphed my data in Desmos and noticed two key things. First is that the data points of each tested cutter are very close to each other, close enough that I believe it's reasonable to assume the tiny variation is caused by human error and recording jank in the measurement. Second is that the data looks eerily close to an exponential function, and although such a function has an asymptote and wouldn't actually reach 0 like my data points do, I feel it's still accurate to say that a cutter's position can be described with an exponential function. After running regression models with my data, and making some inferences based on numbers I would expect an actual developer to write when coding the game, I believe, and that belief is doing some heavy lifting, that this expression is extremely close to, if not an equivalent form of, the real function that drives the cutter's position. The expression in the thumbnail looks a bit different, but is actually the same as what I showed here. I just put the other version in the thumbnail because it looks scarier. Once again, nobody is realistically counting an arbitrary amount of frames and calculating this function in the middle of the fight to predict where the cutter will land. Instead, because this function scripts out the entire attack, let's use it to find a known area during the attack in which it'll be the easiest to begin dodging. But how can someone know exactly how many frames it's been since the start of the attack? This is where sound cues come into play. The sound effects of the cutter act as a built-in timeline for the attack because they play at the same times for each cutter. Not to mention, humans have a faster reaction time to sound cues compared to visual cues. Specifically, there's a bit of an oscillating sound cue I want to focus on. It might be difficult to hear in that clip, but it's actually way easier to hear in-game and in the examples I'll show in a second. The reason that specific oscillating sound is important is because it plays right around this area in the function. Essentially, this oscillating sound tells you that the cutter is right in the middle of an active rotation, meaning that at the moment the sound cue begins to play, the cutter shows you exactly where the safe spot is. In practice, you should be actively crossing the ray of the cutter right as the sound cue plays to guarantee safety. Let me show you a few examples of me actively applying this in-game. In the clips, the exclamation marks at the top will turn red once I hear the sound cue. The dots will become text reflecting what I'm actively thinking in the moment.
I'm kind of upset that I lost my shields. Got to put down. I wanted to like far jump, not just shark kill, but okay.
So far, my trick is working quite well.
Get down, kids a cease. Almost just got sandwiched.
I showed a bit of nuanced thinking based on each specific situation, but if that takes too much brain power, you can simply make sure you're actively crossing the cutter as the oscillating sound cue begins to play, and you'll be perfectly fine. Now, why would I do all this math just to tell you that the solution is to listen for a sound cue? Truth be told, it'd be quite boring to make a 30-second short saying that cutters have a magic sound cue that solves its position, but also, all of this math is to show why this sound cue works, and why it will continue to work every single time. If you don't care about the math behind it, or maybe I explained my math badly, that's fine. But regardless, you can leave this video knowing how to dodge every single cutter. Except for this thing. Maybe that'll be another video. Leave a like and comment if you want me to break down the super cutters as well.